the first speaker of the year, Donna Lawler, who works for Azimuth Advisory. And tonight's topic is a legal one, and the topic is space, not a legal void. Thank you, Donna.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Wayne, and it's great to be here. Hi, all the people I know. It's lovely to see you. Um, and yes, including Eva Wattleseed. So yes, um, I am a space lawyer. I have been working in the space industry since 1999, which is maybe older than some of you actually are, longer than some of you have actually existed. But anyway, sorry about that. I've probably done about $8 billion worth of space transactions over the years. And in 2018, I left. I worked for 20 years at Optus Satellite, left there in 2018, started a firm with the man of my dreams, Stephen Freeland, and we have a space law firm called Azimuth Advisory, and we are space law specialists. Those of you know Stephen Freeland know that he is an international lawyer, and I'm a commercial lawyer. And so our clients tend to be companies in Australia and around the world, countries, and we help a lot of countries with space law and policy, and universities. So that's us, and it's been a fun few years since we started the firm. I thought I'd start with the most basic question: where does outer space begin? Please feel free to ask questions in the chat, and if it's a quick one, feel free to speak up. But if it's going to be a long comment, maybe put that in the chat, and we'll leave it till the end. But it's the most obvious thing. If we're going to be talking about laws that apply in space, where is space? Well, we all know that the territory of a state, like when I say a state in this talk, I'm talking about a country like Australia, extends to the edge of airspace. So Australia owns its airspace. But where does the airspace end? Because we know people are starting to do things in the stratosphere, and where indeed does outer space begin? So if you're going to have international space law and national space law, where does the actual space begin? Does anyone know the answer to that? Does anyone want to?
If we're talking about the Kármán line, then that's 80 kilometres. Well, actually 80 kilometres if you're an American and 100 kilometres if you're European.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, right.
That's right. Well, we all know that Sputnik changed everything when it was launched in 1957, and when it went flying over the Earth, going beep beep beep, and at that time everybody looked up in wonder, and some looked up in horror, and they realized that this was a new area that was beyond national jurisdiction, because no one looked up and said, get off my land. They all just went, oh no, the Russians have got there before we did. At least that's what the American said. The truth is, though, we still don't know for sure where space begins. So every year at the United Nations, there is an agenda item which is the delineation of our outer space, and every year they get nowhere. And the reason they get nowhere is, from a geopolitical point of view, the big countries in particular don't want to agree where space begins, because I'll give you an example why. Who wants to agree where your territory finishes, right? Everybody wants to be able to have their cake and eat it too. So when we're flying over your country and spying, we want to be able to go nice and low. When you're flying over ours, we want to be able to say, get off my land. You're in our territory, you're in our jurisdiction. So it is being deliberately left ambiguous. Australia, as people may know if they've ever done anything in space in Australia, issues licenses to go to space if you're intentionally going over 100 kilometres above mean sea level. But Australia has not defined where space begins. And when Australia first made that law in 1998, they were very quick to assure everybody, we're not delineating where space begins and where airspace ends. We're just doing this for administrative purposes. That's where we're saying. So it's 100 kilometres if you're putting a spacecraft up. That's when you or a rocket over 100 kilometres, you need to get a license from the Australian Space Agency. You also need to get a license if you're going very, very high up, under 100 kilometres, and you're using a high power rocket. But we'll get to that if you like. Okay, moving on. You may have heard people say outer space is the wild, wild west. It's one of those phrases that the media love to use and people just like to use because it's a little bit of a cliche. But don't believe it. There is actually a lot of law that applies to outer space. There are 5 treaties that apply to outer space. The most important one, which is like the Magna Carta of outer space, is from 1967, the Outer Space Treaty. Then we've got a bunch of others that followed, ending with the Moon Agreement in 1979. That was the last treaty that came into force. Unfortunately, not many. Australia signed the Moon Agreement. We've signed all 5. Not many countries signed the Moon Agreement, but it is still a binding agreement on Australia, and it's one of my favourite treaties, actually. I think it's actually a much misunderstood and excellent treaty. Forgive me if I do end up dealing with things that you all know. I won't dwell too much on some of these things. Some of you may know, some of you may not. Okay, so where are these treaties made? Well, they are created in the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which has been going for many decades. They have 2 subcommittees, the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee and the Legal Subcommittee. The picture you can see there is a picture of the Legal Subcommittee. There are now 110 member states. They keep every year, there are a few more. The Legal Subcommittee has had to move into a bigger meeting room in Vienna. But it's becoming a bigger and bigger show. Now, the way that the decisions are made at UN COPUOS in Vienna is consensus. So what that means is if you are trying to create a treaty or even to agree the agenda of something or to agree any kind of document like the report of the proceedings, every single country has a veto right. Every single country has a veto right over every single word. Now, you would think that that would mean you'd grind to a halt and you don't get anything done, but surprisingly enough, they do most of the time reach consensus on the report, and they are rapidly reaching consensus on a number of important initiatives. Sometimes it takes a really long time, about debris mitigation guidelines. It took 10 years or so, but it does actually make progress. So don't let anyone tell you that it's had its day and it's useless. It is a valuable thing still. Now, there's a very important person making a statement at UN COPUOS. That would be me. Not really very important, but I happened to be there and I was asked to give a unbelievably boring statement on behalf of the International Institute of Space Law, the IISL. But it was still kind of a thrill to be up on the big screen and translated into 6 languages. You can see people in the background with earphones on. The reason I showed you this photo was partly because of pure vanity, because I haven't shown anyone before. You're the first. This was last year. But the other reason is because David Schumann from the National Space Society happened to be sitting next to me at the time. He's a very nice guy, an American guy who's moved to Vienna for this reason. Okay, the a little bit of a quick skate across some of the fundamentals just so you have a feeling for what is in these treaties. This is the most important one, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, and the subsequent treaties kind of elaborated on what is in here. So some of the topics that it is dealt with here: freedom to explore and use outer space. So there's free access for everyone, for all nations. Outer space is the use of outer space is the province of mankind. That's, we would now say humankind, but that's how 1967 treaty language describes it. Despite the picture of this American flag, there shall be no appropriation or claims of sovereignty, whether by use or anything else. So don't let anyone think you can claim pieces of the moon or sell pieces of the moon. There can be no appropriation. When it comes to space resources, that's going to turn into a very interesting debate. It is an interesting debate. I think it is well understood, though, that just because you take a little bit of lunar regolith doesn't mean you're appropriating space in itself, or appropriating the moon. Might be a matter of degree. If you started taking vast amounts, people might start to think differently about what you're doing. International law applies in space. That's another principle that applies. So you can't commit genocide in space, for example. There are no nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction permitted in space. That's a very absolute rule. Space is for peaceful purposes, and particularly the moon and celestial bodies may only be used for peaceful purposes. Of course, the scope of that provision is much debated. Of course, we all know that space is used by the military constantly. How far this peaceful purposes principle and rule goes is once again, it's a matter of much debate, but it's an interesting question. When people talk about space being a warfighting domain, it's a problematic thing to say, I would say. There is state, remember that means a country, responsibility for national activities in outer space. So what that means is countries like Australia are responsible for what Australia and Australians do in space. So as Australia is responsible for government activities in space, but also for the activities of private entities and universities and so on in outer space. And this is a little bit different from other domains. So if you take a ship out onto the high seas, Australia isn't responsible for everything you do, and Australia is not liable if you crash into something, if you happen to be an Australian flagged ship. It's different in space. So that's why there is a whole lot of the Australian government is concerned to have some regulation about what we as Australian companies and persons do in outer space. As I mentioned, there is international liability for damage caused by space objects. There's more detail about this in the Liability Convention. And we'll talk about that a little bit more if we've got time. There are also provisions about registration and notification of transparency about what you're doing, and there's a whole range of principles. But these are some of the key things that are relevant to things we do when we are doing activities in outer space. Okay, so as I mentioned, Australia is a party to all 5 major UN space treaties. Australia has also become a signatory to the Artemis Accords. Don't be confused, the Artemis Accords are not a treaty. They are just essentially a bilateral arrangement with the United States. It's a kind of a hub and spoke arrangement. So the United States has made the same treaty with a whole bunch of countries, including Australia. Some are fond of saying that the Artemis Accords are not compatible with the Moon Agreement. I don't think that's correct. It is totally compatible. Every time I touch the chat, it becomes teeny tiny. Oh dear. Okay. Now there's a couple of questions here. If all member states need to vote in favour of any and all regulations, what's the process to begin the termination or change to a treaty? Well, it's not so much that they vote. Silence can be is assent, but essentially you have a veto right. If you wanted to terminate or change a treaty, it would be a really difficult thing. You'd need full consensus. If you wanted to withdraw from a treaty, well, you can do that. So Australia could withdraw from one or all of those treaties, and indeed the Saudis withdrew from the Moon Agreement reasonably recently. Any state can initiate a change, but you'd have to get everyone to agree with you. So you'd want to build a big consensus before you got on your feet and just started chirping about a change. Okay, then we say, as more countries plan Moon and Mars missions, is there a real risk of territorial or boundary disputes in space, similar to geopolitical conflicts on Earth? Well, as I mentioned, there can be no appropriation of outer space. So you can't just draw a dotted line on the moon and say, this is mine. I'm gonna be mining helium-3 in this area. So there is no territory. You can't own an orbit. You can't, even if you have the rights to use frequencies in a certain orbit, it doesn't mean you own it. You just have priorities over others. However, one of the key purposes of what we're doing at the United Nations is to try and avoid a war in space. And so when we are, as space gets more crowded, as more countries think about exploiting resources on the moon, there are some principles being developed about how to make sure that we don't bump into one another or create problems with other users of outer space or people who are doing things on the moon, for example. One of the concepts that is in the Artemis Accords is the Americans have created this concept called safety zones that is not agreed by everyone. For example, China and Russia haven't agreed to the concept of safety zones, but they have this idea that if we're doing mining, then we might just tell you about the safety zone and we think you should stay out of the safety zone in case you create a problem. Some have interpreted that as, oh, you're trying to claim territory. The Americans say, no, we're not. It's one of those controversies. So that's how it is addressing it. We're going to talk a bit more about principles that are going to apply on the moon. I'll get to that a little later. Then Scott says, if no state can own space or the moon, how does that affect large moon-based stations or any other infrastructure that might be built on the moon or Mars? How could that affect a private enterprise wanting to build a facility? They generally want to own their facility or have a structured lease. Well, they're not going to own the land, that's for sure. So space is free to access and use, so no one can stop you from building a facility. But there are some rules about, allowing others access, free access, if you build a moon base, for example. So building a facility and saying, well, only our friends can come in, not the Russians, not the Chinese, that may be problematic. So it remains to be seen how all that's going to work. And if there is, for example, only limited space on the edge of a crater to put a solar array, there might be a bit of a race to be the first to get those spots. But do you own those spots? No, you don't. You don't own it. So it's these are concepts are being hashed out as we speak at the UN. I'll move on because we're going to get to that. I know these are going to be areas that you're going to find a little interesting. Okay. Okay, so some of the specific challenges that are being dealt with at the UN, surprise, surprise, commercial exploitation of space resources. That is actually the hottest game in town. There is discussions of all these other things: space debris, sustainability, mega constellations, space traffic management, militarization, all those things that are listed on there. They're all being discussed at the UN. But the thing that they want to talk about the most, it's probably shouldn't be the most pressing issue. I think mega constellations and space traffic management should be, on debris management, should be the most pressing issue, but it's not. The thing they all want to talk about the most is commercial exploitation of space resources. So that is the hottest and most hotly debated and vibrantly discussed issue by far. Okay, but so let's talk a bit about exploitation of space resources. There is, I don't know if anyone's heard of this, there is a working group on the legal aspects of space resource activities at the UN, at UN COPWAS. Now, what does that mean, a working group? That means all the countries. So that means 110 countries. It's not like, oh, a little 5 of them have gone off and they're talking about this. No, it's everything. The working group is all of the countries. Now, who is the chair of this working group? Well, it's being chaired by the man of my dreams, Australian Emeritus Professor Stephen Freeland. So he is the chair of that group in Vienna. He has prepared the first draft of the principles that are going to apply to space resource activities. So he's prepared the first draft. The first draft comprises a pretty lengthy preamble explaining where it's coming from. There are 10 draft principles, and these are based on submissions by the various countries, the 110 countries who've all prepared many of whom have prepared submissions. They've been kind of distilled into 10 principles about which there seems to be a bit of a common understanding. Of course, there were many other suggestions made by countries about which there wasn't a common understanding, and Stephen has put those possible additional draft provisions into a part 2 of the principles. So these principles, the working group is going for 5 years. It might be extended by a year or so. And I think it finishes at the end of next year. They have already gone through all of the principles once. And there are various suggestions about, we want to change this, we want to change that. But you may be surprised at how quickly they are reaching consensus. Everyone thought this is going to go nowhere, no point in even doing this, but it's kind of shocked people how quickly people are going through. And reaching agreement. You may be wondering why would they be, in the world the way it is, when there's just so much disagreement in the world, why are people reaching consensus about this of all things? Well, when you think about it, I'm just going to compare it to climate change, and you might have heard Stephen on the radio talking about this. If you want to reach consensus on climate change, it's very difficult, because whilst everybody will suffer if we get climate change wrong, who is going to suffer the most? It's going to be the poor countries, the least powerful countries. Think about space. If we ruin space, if we have a war in space, if we have a catastrophe, if we create in space due to a fight about space resources, who's going to lose? It's not going to be the poor countries. It's going to be the ones that suffer the most will be the rich countries, the ones who already have a strategic advantage because of space. So the United States, China, Russia, India, Japan, Europe, they're the ones who will suffer the most if we stuff up space. So that is why contrary to all expectations, there is an enormous amount of engagement. Now, of course, we know that there is one major power that has has changed tack recently and is attacking multilateralism and is not necessarily always behaving rationally and in its own interests. I don't even need to mention who that is. That is a wild card. Last year at Vienna, that particular country was behaving normally. Things were proceeding. We don't know what will happen this year. We'll see what happens in April. So watch this space. So you never know. If the major countries are rational and they are acting in their own interests, they will continue agreeing these principles and compromising as necessary to reach agreement. It doesn't mean it's easy. It's not. It's very difficult. If we find there is one or more countries not acting in their own interests, we'll see. There may be, it may slow things down or even end the process. But so far, so good. It's been going very well so far. This is what the principles look like. You can find it online on the UN USA, so the United States Office of Outer Space Affairs. You can find it on their website. These are the 10 principles of what they deal with: compliance with international law, freedom of access, peaceful purposes. You can see it's kind of reflecting the Outer Space Treaty. Safety, but it's specifically applying it to exploitation of resources on the moon and on celestial objects like asteroids. Sustainability. This is an interesting one. This is a different one. A prioritization of scientific research and investigation. It's an interesting principle. We'll see if that one makes it through to the final draft. Sharing of information and data, absolutely critical if you've got different people maneuvering rovers and, mining equipment and orbital, engaged in orbits around the moon, which is, there's no system for even allocating spectrum on the moon yet, although the ITU is thinking about it. Coordination, cooperation, consultation, international responsibility for activities of that was meant to be non-governmental actors, and then review of principles. So that is a link to it. If anyone wants to just quickly take a screenshot or a photo of that link, you can look it up, or otherwise you can just look it up on the UN USA website. If you're interested in delving into what these draft principles are, and if you want to have input, then talk to the Australian Space Agency. Only states can have direct input into these principles, but through the Space Agency, you can have your say if you want Australia to have a particular approach. There have been some particular conferences in Luxembourg and in Vienna giving private sector input and scientific input into this process. So it's not just lawyers jibber-jabbering. There have been scientists and engineers and private sector companies. Okay, how am I going so far? Any particular... Anything on your mind? I can't actually see you now.
There's no more questions at the moment, Donna. Just keep going.
Okay. Continuing on. All right. So that's all at the international level. What happens at the national level? Well, countries like Australia are obliged to implement the principles in international law into their national laws. Not all countries have, but many have, an increasing number are doing so. Australia was one of the early ones. We had our national space law in 1998. We were pretty early about it. So we had our Space Activities Act in 1998. Then there was a Space Law Review in 2016, and some of you might remember that there was just nascent beginnings of people who wanted to start space business, but they all thought, we need to change the law for us to be able to do stuff. It's all too hard to navigate. It's looks like we have to buy too much insurance. We want changes. So once again, the man of my dreams, Professor Stephen Freeland, conducted a review, wrote a big report, and there were some minor changes made. It became the Space Launches and Returns Act. There's a bunch of rules that are in place. And so now we have a system that is a little bit more fit for purpose. It's not perfect, but I think they acknowledged at the time that if they made wholesale changes and ripped it up and started again, that they'd never make it through Parliament. So realpolitik, they just had to tweak a bit at the edges, but it seems to be working okay, with a few teething problems at first because of a lack of staff at the agency. They needed to all kind of tool up, but I think it's operating reasonably smoothly now, comparatively. Okay, so what happens if you want to do a space activity in Australia? Well, if you want to start a launch facility in Australia, you'll get a launch facility license. If you want to launch an object from Australia, like Gilmore Space, or you want to build your own rocket and launch it from Southern Launch's facility in Kaniba or in Whalers Way, then you'll need to get an Australian launch permit. Both of these, the license and the permit, they're quite involved, quite a lot of information you've got to provide. It's not for the faint-hearted. If you want to return something to Australia, like in the previous photo, recently there was an American company that returned an object to South Australia. You need a return authorization. If you're an Australian and you want to, a company or person, and you want to return an object overseas, and it's not part of your rocket that's already licensed, then you need to get a return authorization as well. So all of these are going to require a certain amount of insurance. What if you just want to launch a CubeSat or even a big satellite overseas? You'll need what's called an overseas payload permit. Interestingly, there's nothing about launching a rocket overseas. It's just an overseas payload. So if you actually want to build your own rocket and launch it overseas, that might be a little bit of a gap in the legislation, or they might need to play around with what is a payload. I mentioned that there's another kind of rocket permit. There was a bit of discussion about, should CASA be regulating this or should the Space Agency? And they've kind of took a little while, but they figured out who was regulating what. So if there's a certain definition of a high power rocket, and if it's, if it's got a guidance navigation system, or if it goes over a certain amount of power, then you need to toddle over to the Australian Space Agency and get one of these. Once again, you'll need some insurance. And then there are a bunch of provisions in there about liability for third-party damage. It used to be that you needed a maximum of 750 million. Everybody threw up their hands in 2016 and said, what, $750 million? We can't do that. That's too big. So that maximum was changed to $100 million. Of course, it's only a maximum. You can work out the maximum probable loss, and if the maximum probable loss based on a certain calculation is less than that, then that's all you've got to get. But 100 million is now the maximum. If you're launching overseas, the amount is zero. Now, there's another question. VADA is the US company that wants to return capsules to Australian output. They already have. They've already done a couple. It's trying to synthesize pharma drugs in microgravity. Yes, that is true. And I wrote the contract for that. So they've got a whole bunch planned. So that could be an interesting. Watch this space if you're in South Australia, literally. So yeah, the 750 million was a bugbear for those who are Dungeons and Dragons fans, which was removed. Okay, so why, in any case, why is the Australian government forcing you to have insurance. Well, we know that you're being forced to have insurance for a car if you want to drive a car. Well, it's a little bit similar. If you want to fly a spacecraft do one of these things, fly a rocket or from Australia or return an object to Australia, the Australian government wants you to have insurance for third parties. When we say third parties, we mean not you, not the people you've contracted with, but people who are unrelated, innocent bystanders who happen to get a rocket fall on their head or hitting their spacecraft or hitting their ship or plane. They're third parties. But why in particular do space regulators care and not regulators of shipping or aircraft, right? Why is it different particularly? Well, the reason is international law, the Outer Space Treaty and the Liability Convention. So, as I mentioned, if a citizen of a state crashes a car or a ship or a plane outside its territory, it might be really bad. If you're in Italy and you're driving around, you crash into a fridge stall, you might be sued, you might be thrown in jail, but you won't get the Italian government ringing up the Australian government and trying to get some money. It won't be the Australian taxpayer who pays. However, if you have a space object and you crash into another space object or a plane or you have a rocket and it lands on something on Earth, Australia may be liable if you're Australian under the Liability Convention. So who is liable? Well, it's what's called launching states. So the Liability Convention only applies to countries who are launching states at the moment of launch. So that means if you buy a spacecraft in orbit and then you crash it into something, Australia isn't liable unless Australia was also a launching state at launch. It's not always rational, this system, but that is the reason why Australia will require you to purchase a level of third-party liability insurance. The liability on Earth or in the air is strict. In other words, it doesn't matter if it's not your fault. If you crash into the International Space Station in space, you're only liable under this treaty if you are also at fault. So if you did something, if you were negligent in the way you built your spacecraft or something. This is a bit of a little weird legal quirk. Once a launching state, always a launching state. When we're teaching space law, we make people chant that. Once a launching state, always a launching state. What that means is if, let's say, Wayne Short launches a spacecraft and gets a overseas payload permit. He launches it on SpaceX, up it goes, it flies around, but then he sells it to Evacan, right? Eva now owns it. No, actually, better not be Eva, better be someone overseas. He sells it to Elon Musk, right? It does not become an American space object just because it's been sold to an American. Australia remains a launching state, and Australia remains potentially liable if it turns out that spacecraft was negligently constructed. And I'm sure you wouldn't negligently construct a spacecraft, Wayne. But anyway, there are some funny anomalies that give you some unexpected results. Okay. So as I mentioned, if you're launching, you need to buy third-party liability insurance of up to $100 million or the max loss. If you're launching the payload outside Australia, it's zero. Now, can anyone think of why that would be? Why zero? Because Australia is just as liable if if Wayne Short's spacecraft crashes into the International Space Station. Australia is just as liable. Well, the reasoning behind decision, which sits in the rules, is because the most risky part of that is going to be the launch. The launch agreement is reviewed, and the Australian government is going to be checking the launch agreement to make sure that they're named on the launch liability policy of the launch provider. So they will review the SpaceX agreement or the Arianespace agreement or the Rocket Lab agreement, and they'll say, okay, it looks like Australia is named on this policy. We're going to be okay for a launch plus 10 days at least. We're cool with that. The risk is an acceptable level. The risk isn't zero, but the risk is acceptable. So anyway, that's just a little bit of a weird little quirk. Here's another little weird quirk. Over and above that compulsory insured amount. So let's say you're Gilmore and you launch from Queensland, and you have $50 million worth of insurance. Okay, let's say that's what they've determined you need under your maximum probable loss. As long as Gilmore buys that $50 million worth of insurance, if they hit a plane, let's just say they accidentally hit a plane, and the liability under the liability convention is $100 million, the Australian government will cover that. And let's say they go up and Gilmore, came down and crashed into a ship in Australian waters, an Australian ship. The Australian government will pay up to $3 billion for loss suffered by Australians. So what that means is it's almost a statutory insurance scam for space activities. So when you explain that to people from the aviation industry, for example, they're just outraged. They're like, what? We don't get that. You're so lucky in space. So consider yourselves lucky, space industry people. That is actually a remarkable and interesting piece of legislation. It is reflecting what they do in the US, Russia, France. It's not. We're not the only ones who do that, but it's unusual for. It's not unusual for space, but it's unusual for other industries. Scott has another question. Once a launching state, always a launching state position would have interesting consequences for the Kessler syndrome, where a satellite collision cascades to multiple collisions from the debris. You're absolutely right. It's you never know. Of course, the only ones at fault once you're in space, Scott, are those who are at fault. But let's say Wayne sold his spacecraft to Airbus, say, and it's a French company, and let's say it then broke up and created a cascade of debris like the Kessler syndrome. Australia could arguably still be liable, even though a French company owned the spacecraft at that point. On a little sideline, you're all aware, no doubt, of what the Kessler syndrome is, this cascading multiple collisions caused by space debris. Stephen recently received an essay allegedly written by a student, which talked about space debris and which said, above all, we need to avoid the kosher syndrome. So, strong suggestion that one was written by AI. So we have to look out for both the Kessler syndrome and, according to this student, the kosher syndrome. I hope you're all guffawing at that. I can't hear you.
Yes.
I'm going to talk a little bit about insurance. This is a reason why we need insurance. In the remaining, let's say we've got about 10 minutes left before I try and wind up. I just want to explain a little bit now. We've talked about the international level. We've talked about the national level, Australian law. Let's talk about contracts, the commercial level, because I know some of you in the room have had some painful experience with me with me negotiating contracts. Sorry, all contract negotiations are a little bit painful, but you know, someone's got to do it. Space contracts are different from other types of contracts, and I'm going to explain a little bit why that is. It all starts with, oops, hang on, trying to do that again. It all starts with insurance. So space insurance makes the world go round, certainly the space world go round. I don't need to tell you that spacecraft are expensive, slow to build, they're delicate, launch is risky, the space environment is harsh, it's easy for things to break down, it's usually difficult or impossible to repair an orbiting spacecraft. The risk of collisions is increasing. Watch out for that Kosher syndrome. As a result of all these things, insurance is scarce and expensive. Jeremy, Wayne says, who's doing insurance in space? I wasn't aware of any Australian companies. There are some Australian brokers. There's no insurers in space. There are some brokers, for example, Expanse Insure is based in Melbourne. They will arrange, and they are working with a number of Australian space companies trying to get insurance for them or getting insurance for them. How do you protect a sovereign government from liability once a satellite is sold to a foreign owner who might maneuver it recklessly? So true. Can the sovereign government step in and not allow the transfer? Well, it depends if they know about it, Jeremy. Our laws don't actually require anyone to tell the government if we sell an Australian satellite to another country. The Australian government is perfectly within their rights, and they may start doing this more, to put in their conditions for authorising a launch of a satellite. They might put in the conditions something that says, and you have to tell us if you sell it, and you have to give us the right to object, for example, because the Australian government might want to make arrangements with that other country. They may want to make sure that no export controlled information is transferred. They may want to make sure that it continues to be insured, or make sure that whoever is receiving it has the capability of flying it. So some countries do regulate the transfer of spacecraft in orbit. Others don't. Australia doesn't expressly, at least not in a way that's on the books. They might in conditions to the license. But it's a really good question, Jeremy. Okay, so what do we do about this? Who'd be a space insurer? I said it's scarce and expensive. Well, have a think about this. In 2023, there were space premiums of $600 million US. So happy days. You want to be a space insurer? That sounds pretty good. You could, earn yourself 600 million in premiums. Oh, hang on a sec. Then there was the Viasat 3 failure, then an Inmarsat failure, then a Rocket Lab failure. And as a result, there were claims of around $1 billion. So in that year, the insurance industry didn't make money, they lost money. And a number of, some insurers exited the market, and that meant insurance premiums went up because there was less capacity available. So it's a bit of a volatile market. Premiums have gone up to 18% of the insured amount before, or sometimes they might go down as low as 3 or 4, depending on how much capacity there is, how many accidents there were recently. This market I'm talking about, insurance for the loss of the spacecraft, not for third-party liability, which is a separate market altogether. But it gives you a little bit of a feel for the risks involved and why not all insurers write space insurance, only a small number write space insurance. And if you've got an expensive program like a geostationary satellite, you essentially need about a year to travel around the world selling your risk, and no one insurer will insure the whole lot. You're going to get, 5% from here, 3% from here, 10% from here. You gradually try and build it up and to insure the whole risk. But really, you're selling the risk. It's not so much you're buying the insurance, you're selling the risk to them. I mean, you're paying premiums, but that's how it works. In a traditional geostationary program, this is the way the program will work. You'll build it, you'll transport it. There'll be this moment of intentional ignition or launch. Then you orbit raise, you separate, and you have operations. So this is how a space program works. Well, there's two different kinds of insurance. One is insurance for your satellite. So let's say you have a geostationary satellite. You will be insured. If you buy this insurance policy, you're likely to be insured for loss, damage, and failure in orbit of this spacecraft. Before launch, it's probably your spacecraft manufacturer that is going to be insuring it. Doesn't matter who breaks it, they will be insuring it. Even if, it's destroyed by some third party, they have to insure it. Then at the moment of intentional ignition, it all switches over back to you, and you, the owner, have to, you don't have to, but if you want to be insured, you would generally buy your own launch and in-orbit insurance. This is assuming it's not a delivery in orbit. Liability to others, like if you crash into a plane or another spacecraft, on the ground, it's going to be the spacecraft manufacturer. During the launch, it's going to be the launch provider, so SpaceX, Arianespace, Gilmore Space. They're going to have to buy it for launch plus 10 days, launch plus 30 days, whatever. And after that, it's up to you. You can insure or not insure. So that's how things are done in the geostationary area. These definitions, like intentional ignition and launch, are super important to define properly. Lawyers get it wrong all the time. It's a really interesting point of discussion between lawyers and engineers. In case you're wondering what a terminated ignition is, it means you've had an intentional ignition, you've started the launch, but then it ended up not going anywhere. Here is an example. I don't know if you can hear this.
No, I don't hear any audio. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well,
is that Gordon Pike's satellite, the Chinese one? Yes. Okay. Yep.
Yeah. So here's the intentional ignition. You'll see it there.
There's an Optus one. Yep.
Yep. And there we go. It's supposed to go. Oh. That's not supposed to happen. Anyway, it's interesting if you can actually hear it because there's a lot of commentary going on in Chinese. So, but that's an example of a terminated ignition. If that happens to you, you're going to be running to read your contract to make sure, and your insurance policy to make sure that you're covered. You don't want to find out that it happens to be the one moment in time when you've fallen between the gaps of two insurance policies. And that all depends on whether you got the definition of terminated ignition and launch identical in your launch contract, your satellite purchase agreement, and your insurance policy. And believe it or not, they're not standard definitions. And unless you really pay attention, they will definitely be wrong. Okay. When you make a claim for insurance, what's the value given for the satellite? Well, you will choose that. If you generally the value is, it wouldn't be the lost revenue. You wouldn't generally, unless you pay extra. Generally what it'll cover is a new satellite, a new launch and a new lot of insurance. That's the traditional way to insure a spacecraft, to make sure you don't get, but you'll have obviously a maximum amount you can claim. So it is wise, whenever I buy a geostationary satellite, I always make sure I get an option to buy a second one. Because if you do have a failure of the first one and you get insurance, you want an option to buy a second one at a fixed price. Otherwise, who knows, the price might double, and then doesn't matter how much insurance you got, you won't be able to buy a new one. But that's generally how it works. You won't win back your lost revenue. That's just too bad, so sad. For new space, so if you've just got a little CubeSat, it's really too small to have that big, expensive lot of insurance. And some insurance companies are just insuring the whole thing, the mission insurance. But it's still not easy to get mission insurance, especially if it's an experimental spacecraft. It needs to have some space heritage. Let's see. Oh, I've gone a little bit over time. Will you just grant me 5 extra minutes, Wayne?
No problems.
I know you said this is just something I want you all to understand about. So I've explained why space contracts are different. I just want you to understand how they are different, and I'll do it fairly quickly so we don't keep you for too long. But because insurance is scarce, it means that you must use the scarce global insurance resources efficiently. So whilst the usual practice for a terrestrial contract, like if you're buying a computer system, is to have liability for failure based on fault, in other words, Wayne, you built me a computer computer system and it doesn't work, so I'm going to sue you to get my money back or something, right? For example. In space contracts, it's different. So as between the mission participants, me as the buyer and Wayne as the satellite manufacturer, the risks of the mission failure are generally managed on a no-fault basis. Now, try and explain this to government. It's very tricky, okay? So generally, if Wayne, if I was buying a satellite from you, you would generally have a contract that says, that's great, Donna. Make sure you paid everything before launch. If it doesn't work in space, it's up to you to insure it or not. Up to you, Donna, but don't come crying to me. That's what you'll say. It's very, very difficult to explain this to government buyers, that they're not going to be able to get their money back if it doesn't work in space, unless the vendor buys insurance. But then you're just paying all this extra money. You're better off just insuring it yourself. Yeah. It's not best practice, let's put it this way. Okay. What about as between mission participants? So we've talked about third parties, and we've talked about, people on your, people you're buying a spacecraft from. But what about, for example, everybody else who's involved in the launch? So what, for example, if we are on the same launch, by way of example, and your spacecraft blows up my rocket, or my rocket blows up your spacecraft, or my rocket blows up your spacecraft, or my employee is injured at your launch site. Okay, this is a big SpaceX explosion where it was poor old Mark Zuckerberg's spacecraft was blown up. This is the way things work. I'm going to have to do it quite quickly, but in launch contracts and in many space mission contracts, each participant, so everyone who's got any contractual involvement or financial involvement, looks after its own people and property and its own financial well-being. And the contract will always contain a clause called an inter-party cross waiver. So essentially what that means is, let's say I was Mark Zuckerberg and I put my $400 million spacecraft on this rocket. Elon Musk was negligent. He blew it up. Doesn't matter if he was negligent. Mark Zuckerberg, have to pay for my own losses. Actually, what would have happened then is I would have gone back to my spacecraft manufacturer and they would have had to cover the losses, or their insurers. But this is the way that space missions are done. The reason they're done this way is because there is not enough insurance in the whole world for everyone to insure everyone else's stuff. So unless everyone agrees, all right, no one is going to sue anyone if we blow up one another's stuff. Unless we all agree that, there will be no space industry. There will be no launch. There will be no access to outer space. So what the cross waivers say is every participant in a launch, and this also applies to space missions, must waive claims against everybody else involved. So even if you blow up mine, I'm not going to sue you. Everybody has to get waivers from their associates, like their bankers, their customers. And if they fail to get those waivers, then that's on whoever failed to get the waiver. I don't have time to spend too much time on this, but it only works if they're absolutely universal. Everybody involved signs. Everybody who could possibly sue anybody must sign. And the reason we need it is to avoid multiple overlapping insurance policies for the same launch, which would make space unviable. So the history behind these waivers is in the 1980s. The US was desperately trying to, after the space shuttle failures, they were trying desperately to get a private launch business going or industry going. Arianespace had lower insurance costs. The Americans could not start private launch companies, not afford the insurance. So they invented these ideas called cross waivers. However, they only work if they're universal. Everyone, including government, must sign. So what did they do? There's always someone who says, I'm not signing that, right? In 1988, the US Congress made it compulsory. So in the US, it's compulsory. In Australia, it isn't compulsory. However, if we want to have a viable, insurable industry, we need everybody in Australia to get their heads around what a cross waiver is, because unless we have universal acceptance, we're not really going to be able to develop space infrastructure. That's my personal view. And I'm going to stop there because I've blathered on long enough, but happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, Donna. It's great talk and very practical. It's probably the words I'm using for people, because I know a lot of people have probably been thinking about this for a while, and now we actually get to understand a bit more about the rules. There has been a lot of questions asked, so that's probably the most interesting thing. Just an aside with something that happened just in the last week. You're aware that HEO bought a satellite?
Who did? Sorry, HEO?
HEO, yeah, Will Crow's
Yes.
company.
Yes.
I'm assuming that will be a similar issue with the insurance side about who they bought that from and the type of liability it then has, obviously, now that it's been passed on to another owner.
That's right. Yeah. So that is not an Australian space object.
No, that's what I would have thought. I think it was an overseas satellite that he's bought. So he's now trying to work out what the name's going to be. I don't think he's still got his name sorted out.
Yeah.
Putting a
but
few
that's
things
where
on it.
once a launching state, always a launching state, right? So
Right.
the original launching states of that satellite, and there can be more than one, are they will retain liability even if Will flies the spacecraft into the International Space Station.
Yeah, I think the orbit's a bit different, but you're right. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. But I mean, there may be other sources. If he did crash into someone, there may be other sources of liability, just straight old negligence in Australia or something like that.
Yeah,
But
I think that was the interesting thing about it was it's one of the fact that we've now got a satellite was there's not a lot of companies with satellites these days, and that was one of the breakthroughs that it actually got. I believe that Gilmore Space actually had a test launch of a satellite last year, and that was actually done by SpaceX. So that would have been similar issues with the insurance on that. It wasn't their launch vehicle; it was SpaceX's launch vehicle, but it was Gilmore Space's satellite bus that they were testing.
Yes. So, for example, they would have had to get an overseas launch permit, and the overseas launch permit would have said the requirement if you're launching overseas is zero, the amount of insurance they have to buy, but SpaceX is required by the US government to have insurance.
Yep.
And the idea is that if you're buying a launch, you should make sure that your launch provider covers the Australian government in its third-party liability, so that you can become a named insured. You'd want to make sure that you and the Australian government are covered in the insurance. That's how it's done. So,
yeah, I understand the satellite's actually been quite successful, so they had good results out of it. But obviously, it's a different one to what, because they eventually want to actually launch it on their own rockets, but they haven't got that going first. But at least they've been able to test out the satellite bus, which is great. But it was a different example.
Yeah, it was a great success, really.
Yes, that's right.
Mm.
Okay, have we got anybody else who wants to ask questions? No, I know it's a few people making comments in the chat, which has been great earlier.
Yeah, thank you. But thank you for
Donna. Oh,
yeah, sure.
Sorry, Donna. Very interesting talk. Thank you. I was going to come back to the question of at fault, because I think you said that for instance, myself, as an Australian, my satellites have Australia as the launching state.
Yeah.
And I think you said that Australia would only be liable if we were at fault.
Yeah, you'd only be liable if the accident happened in space. You're only liable if Australia is somehow at fault, or if you are somehow at fault. If let's just say during the launch, the rocket containing your small satellite crashed into a plane, tragically, and there was $1 billion worth of loss. Australia, and did you launch on SpaceX? It was SpaceX.
Oh yes.
Yeah, Australia and the United States would be jointly and severally liable, which means that even though it was 100% Elon Musk's fault, right? He should have not launched if there was a plane in the way. 100% US fault, but Australia is potentially liable for the whole lot. So let's just say it was a French plane, France could turn around to Australia and say, I want $1 billion, please. And you could go, well, hang on a second, it was Elon Musk's fault. It's like, too bad, so sad. We're suing you. Give us $1 billion, right? So jointly and severally, you are just as liable for 100% as the United States is. That's how it is.
Okay, because I thought you said that we had to do something active to be at fault.
Well, not if the damage is on Earth or to a plane.
Sorry,
to
yes, but if it's in space,
it's different.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Then it's different. Okay, that's what you said. That if it's in space, it's different.
Now that you're in space, you can breathe easily, and as long as you don't do anything negligent, you should.
Or actively steer our spacecraft towards the ISS,
for example.
Then
don't do that.
Yeah. Although I did have a dream about it last night, not actively doing so, but just my spacecraft having drifted down to the space station altitude and then whacking into it.
Ouch!
And I was happily saying, "Well, look, mate." Oh, it's not my fault. They didn't get out the way.
There's no definition of what fault is. But, now that we've got various UN guidelines and we've got debris mitigation guidelines and so on. And, obviously if you didn't fix the solar array on properly and it just fell off and, smashed into something, well, that starts to look a lot like fault if you didn't follow the debris mitigation guidelines, for example.
Right.
But what if the space station could have gotten out of the way? Because they're more maneuverable than
You could argue that.
Yeah.
You could say, I mean, remember when there was a Starlink spacecraft that was heading for a giant European spacecraft, and the Europeans are sending emails to Starlink saying, please move out of the way. Please don't crash into us. And nobody was monitoring the email. And so the Europeans had to move their giant spacecraft out of the way of the tiny Starlink one, which, wasn't. Now, if they'd chosen not to move, would they be at fault? I don't know. I mean, you'd have all those arguments in the Claims Commission.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
there is what's called a mooting court, so kind of mock trials for students called the Manfred Lachs Space Mooting Competition. It's an international mooting competition, and people dream up all of these scenarios, and law students have to argue them as if they were barristers in the International Court of Justice, and the final is at IAC. So if you're ever at IAC, it's always good to attend that final and you get to see how all the hypothetical scenarios play out.
Excellent. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I just made a comment of the Gilmore Space Bowen site. One of the problems that they have up there with that launch site is, apart from they've got to obviously deal with the weather forecasting as well, is it's actually very close to active shipping lanes. So they've got to really understand what's going on with the shipping around there as well if they're going to do a launch.
No, exactly. And of course the flights.
Yeah, so it's just one of the problems with where it is, particularly because I think it's a coal loader up there. It's one of the major mines, and because of that port around there, for that reason, it's not used every day, but it's used quite frequently each week. So they have to be very careful with one of the problems with doing the launches up there for that reason. So people weren't aware of it.
And there's a lot of Asian countries that are looking at launch, Malaysia, Thailand. There's a lot of, it's become, remember back in the day, every country had to have an airline, because even if it wasn't economically viable, everybody had to have an airline. Well, increasingly, everybody has to have a spaceport. So a number of Asian countries are looking at having spaceports, and we're being engaged by a number of them to try and help them work out their space law and policy around it. But if you look at the shipping lanes around there, I mean, goodness, it's pretty busy. Pretty busy.
Yeah, Singapore and Korea would be the two ones that I would think of that, but potentially have a lot of shipping.
Exactly.
So they've got to be really careful. But I do think that countries like Indonesia and Malaysia do want an active space program, but obviously they've got financial problems. But they're countries that certainly do want to be participants. Yep. Okay, so I think we got.
I should probably wrap up and let you tell us about Artemis, Wayne.
Oh, that's all right. Anyway, but look, I appreciate that really excellent talk, and it's covered so many things that people I know have had questions about how it all works. So congratulations. It was a great talk.
Oh, thank you.